Hello. Before we get started with the show, we wanted to draw your attention to our crowdfunding page on Patreon. If you've been enjoying Always Take Notes, please do consider supporting us there. It helps us to keep the podcast going.
If you support us on Patreon, you can get a great selection of rewards as well as a shout out on the show. Thanks to our latest donor, Ollie Franklin Wallace.
Ollie was a guest on Always Take Notes, number 15, back in the day. He's also a freelance magazine writer who is currently working on his first book. What he likes about Always Take Notes, many things, though he says he always admires Simon's shamelessly brutal questioning about money and technique. Glad you're enjoying that, Ollie.
We've recently launched a new tier for our most generous supporters. If you pledge $20 a month, you get a free 2-month trial to Otter worth $26. Otter offers automated transcription and live note-taking for in-person and virtual meetings. I found it to be a huge help in transcribing interviews as well. You also get access to a series of mini-episodes from previous guests on the show, in which they answer 3 revealing questions. The latest episode features Sophie Elmhurst, and here's a snippet.
I'd sort of fall into a bit of a rut and produce something a little bit formulaic, and it really taught me that, you know, each subject, each person, anything that you write about really deserves its own kind of specific engagement, specific treatment, and that you don't want to kind of start colouring by numbers, I guess. A trait that a journalist should possess.
Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. This is a slightly different episode in that Rachel kindly agreed to interview me because I've got my book just coming out. Thank you very much, Rachel.
A pleasure. I spoke to Simon about The Changing of the Guard, his new book, about his magazine journalism, and about balancing time as a freelancer.
Thank you very much for having me on, Rachel.
It's a great episode. I hope listeners enjoy it. Welcome, Simon, to Always Take Notes on the other side of the microphone. Thanks for joining me.
It's great to be here, Rachel. Thank you for having me, and maybe for humouring me would be a way to describe it as well.
We'll see. It'll be the same treatment as everyone else. Could we start by talking about your early journalistic ambitions? You wrote for the student newspapers, the Oxford Student and the Cherwell. Did you want to be a writer from childhood, or was it definitely something that developed at university?
I think it was from childhood, really. I mean, I just always loved to write. It was a compulsion, and one that really went back as long as I could. And I remember, like a number of guests on the show, I wrote some pretty bad adolescent poetry, which has fortunately not survived. I also, when I was at school, I set up a magazine, an underground magazine that was theoretically a joint effort, but I actually wrote all of it. And it was banned after its second issue. My school was...
Why was it banned?
Well, my school was called The Purse, and the magazine was called The Purse Version. And its tagline underneath it was that the school was one of the few places in Cambridge to have been bombed during the Second World War, and the tagline was "the best thing to hit the school since the Luftwaffe," and it was a sort of puerile mix of adolescent satire, which I entirely wrote myself. And yeah, it was. It did not survive beyond a single issue, but I did really love to write, and it was something that I was obsessed by, I suppose. And then I spent a year in the army. We'll come back to that. But then I did an English degree as an undergraduate, and I wanted to be a journalist, I suppose, by that stage. And I got really involved in student journalism at Oxford, and I rose up the ranks of the Cherwell to the deputy editor position, and then there was a sort of palace coup, and I moved over to the Oxstu and edited that. So yeah, I was kind of one of those slightly tragic people who were really into this from an early age, I suppose.
And then when you left Oxford, you went to the Columbia Journalism School, and you had a Fulbright scholarship for that. Did you have a full one? Because I know that the fees are very expensive to go over to Columbia.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I had a year out in between, so after I did my finals, I went to Egypt for a year. I wanted to be a foreign correspondent at that stage, and I studied Arabic and did a bit of freelancing. But I then got a Fulbright to Columbia, and so I got $40,000, and I was the hinge year. So the year that I went, it covered all of your fees. But the year before I went, it covered all your fees and they gave you a stipend. And actually what has happened since then, I think, is that they have diluted those scholarships further in that they've made a decision that they want to spread their money among more people, which is a decision that I don't agree with, actually. I don't think it's the right way it should work. So for me, I had $40,000 from the Fulbright Commission, which paid all my fees, and then I got about another $16,000 in funding from. I won some awards, and I applied for everything I could. But New York is an expensive city, and essentially the funding that I got meant that going to Columbia cost about what it would to go to City if I'd been in the UK, roughly. So it made, I couldn't have gone without a scholarship, but I also still had some support from my family to do it. And I think that's sort of problematic. I think with those big transatlantic scholarships, what they should do is, like, if you get one, it should be a full ride. I think that's the fair way that it works.
And what appealed to you about going to New York rather than doing the City version of that?
I think it was speculative, actually, and it's interesting to look back at it in retrospect, because I didn't get a first when I was doing my finals. I was really, which I thought I would, and I would. I'd always been very good at passing exams. I'd always got the top grade in every exam and everything like that. I'd got a first in mods, and I didn't. I got a sort of quite plodding 2-1, and I found that a really difficult experience at the time, and it was something I'd been really emotionally invested in, and didn't get it. And then I applied for that scholarship basically on a whim, actually. Like, a guy who'd been the year above me, Peter Cardwell, had it, but I applied for it without really any emotional investment at all, and I only applied to Columbia. So I then got the scholarship, and I then had this slightly weird experience where if then I didn't get into Columbia, I'd have to give the money back. So I made like slight attempts to look like I was applying to other places, and then got in. But it was actually, the kind of lesson of it was, I think, that the things that you really care about don't necessarily work out, and the things that sometimes really transform your life are things that just happen, because it really did transform my life, that experience.
When you got there, what was the format of the teaching like? And I think more generally, what are the sort of tangible differences in American approaches to journalism versus the British approach?
It's a really good question. I didn't go to City, right? So I don't have a point of comparison. But the thing about Columbia is, like, it's in an Ivy League university. It's in the heart of New York. It gives out the Pulitzers. It has a kind of institutional heft that is really substantial. Although the history of the institution is bizarre in that it was set up by Joseph Pulitzer, who was a manic depressive Hungarian immigrant who falsified large parts of the Spanish-American War in order to sell newspapers. And when he'd tried initially to give his money to Columbia, they'd refused and said, you might as well have a graduate school of swimming. And he then waited for 10 years until they had a new president of the university and told them if they didn't take his money, he'd give it to Harvard. So, like, that was in the gestation of Columbia, but it had subsequently acquired this big institutional heft. And I mean, for me, it was completely tied up with being in the US. I'd been to America once before when I was 4 or 5. And I remember arriving in New York, and it just kind of blew me away. But it also was this exposure to American journalism. And I think, it's just fundamentally the social position of the reporter is different in the US. And I think that's partly a function of the Constitution, of the kind of First Amendment respecting protection for free speech, although those protections only really evolved in the 20th century. It's also a function of just the profit margins for American newspapers historically were much larger. They had much larger staffs. But there's also just a kind of, the cynical way you think about it is that American journalists think they're priests, right? Like, they really think it's a sort of really important public calling. And I remember being a bit cynical about that when I arrived. I thought that American newspaper prose was turgid. But I actually really embraced it. And I think now that, I think the fact that American journalism takes itself seriously is wonderful. And the particular exposure I had was to American magazine writing, which I just didn't really know existed, this tradition of really hyper-reported stuff. But I remember, it was an extraordinary experience, because I was 23, I'd done a gap year, I was a year out of university, I was living in New York. Like, it had it feels like you're in a movie set. I remember Gossip Girl was once filmed on campus, and all teaching ground to a halt. No, it didn't entirely, but that happened. I think at the same time that, the fundamental questions that are raised about journalism education, like to what extent you can teach it in a classroom stuff, that's still apparent, But for me, it was intrinsically tied up with this fact that privileged me to go to the US and to see this other tradition.
In terms of that question of how you do teach journalism, I mean, how is it divided up into modules for you? Was it the 9 a.m. shorthand on a Monday?
No, they don't teach shorthand. So, which is weird because like the one sort of definable thing you can teach in journalism school, they regard as a weird like Anglo-Australian affectation. So they don't have that. So the course was in. I mean, I was there in 2008, 2009. So it was like the worst year in the history of the American newspaper market. Like things were falling to pieces. I remember I was in New York when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. I was visiting another Fulbrighter at Harvard that weekend. And extraordinarily, they had at the Harvard Business School, they had a casino-themed party. But at that time, the core of the Columbia syllabus was this thing called RW1, so Reporting and Writing 1, which was the idea that you were given a sort of beat in New York, and you would have to go out and find stories on it and things, quite similar to how it worked at City. I did this, but also I kind of absconded quite a lot to do magazine assignments when I was there, and I was able to, it was, and then there were then there were options and courses, and I did quite a lot of photography. Actually, I did a writing about the arts course. It's funny because I feel like I've drawn an enormous amount from that experience, but it was a mix of being in America, of the people, the cohort that I met, and of the teaching. It was all tied up, for me as a one. And I do think if the US government had not been paying for it, it would have been a very different equation. That is the truth of it.
So what was your transition from Columbia to working at the New York Times? And could you tell us a little bit more about what you did there? The sorts of piece you were writing?
It was quite weird, actually. In that I applied for all these internships in America. And I remember going to see the careers service, and they looked at my resume, as they referred to it, and they were like, what's an A-level and stuff like that and things. There was quite a lot of cultural incomprehension. And I remember being told, you can apply for this summer program at the New York Times, but they won't take you, they'll never take a foreigner. And so I was just like, okay, I'm just going to do it anyway. And I'd sent some clips, and I had a few clips at this point from some stuff I'd written at university and some stuff I'd written in Egypt. And I sent that stuff in, and I got a phone call from a woman saying, look, we don't ever take foreigners, but we do like your stuff. Do you want to come in one day a week? And so I stayed, when I was at Columbia, my second semester, I went one day a week to the Times, and I worked on this thing that was called Times Topics, that was like kind of an attempt, I think, internally, I don't even know if it survived, but to make a sort of Wikipedia from former Times articles, like a research, a kind of encyclopedic thing. And it wasn't really journalism, it was like an amalgamation thing. And then I was doing that, and then I had this girlfriend who was a British girl who I got together with, who was coming to Columbia the next year. And I wanted to be with her, and I wanted to stay in New York. And I remember going to talk to them and saying, like, could I, just keep working here? And as far as I recall, they were just like, okay. And so what they did was they put me on their summer program, which was this like incredibly competitive thing that, about 9 gazillion Americans applied for each place. And I was then put on that. And so I sort of slightly zigzagged my way in. But then I think what was so impressive about that was like, I was an intern, but you were paid, you were paid really pretty well, and you were expected to do really real work. So like they sent me, and I think this was possibly as a joke, they sent me to the cop bureau on my like first day, which was like and I found it a really intimidating, place to go and work. Not because people, it's not a shouty or environment or anything like that, but it was the New York Times. And they sent me to go and work at what was called the Shack, which historically had actually been a literal shack at the police headquarters where supposedly the cops and the reporters played poker together, and the rule was that if your editor called, you had to finish the hand before you took the call. I mean, none of that was happening when I was there, but it was these offices with the Times was there and AP was there, and then all the New York tabloids were there, and there were like extraordinary characters. There's a man who looked like Kaniki from Greece who sort of worked for one of these places, and the way it worked was that there were people in New Jersey who had radio scanners who scanned police frequencies, and then they sent you subscribed to some kind of email service where they sent intercepted police messages to you about which were like people being attacked or whatever, and you then had to call the police. It was all really quite like weird, but engaging. And I did that. And then I did sort of General Metro, and I worked there, I think initially it was like for 3 months. I worked there all summer, and it was amazing. Like you was getting stuff in the paper. I got a front page, and they give you the actual metal that's printed off. And then I was in this situation. It was all governed by visas, really, because when you work in the US, if you're going to the US on a standard student visa, you have what's called, I don't know what the terminology, OPT or something, a period of time where you're legal to work after your course is as long as your course had been. But I was on a distinct visa because I was a Fulbright. So I still had this period, but they had backdated it to when I'd started being an intern. So I basically had about 7 months of work legality afterwards. And I wanted to stay working, and I basically I wanted to talk to them, and I ended up working with this guy, Walt Bogdanich, who had won, he's still there, he's won like 3 Pulitzers, he's a very respected American journalist. And I remember saying, like, can I continue to freelance for you? And they were like, yes. And I was like, can I freelance from within the building? And they were like, okay. So I basically just stayed there till as long as I could. So I was there for 5 months and all. And I did a lot. I wrote, dozens of stories. I had this front page and all that, but I couldn't stay. I mean, partly it was because, the paper was in a really difficult financial place at that stage. They weren't hiring people, but also, and this is the bigger thing I think about going to America, like in terms of visas, I could not stay in America. So I had to leave. And that is what was really dislocating. And I remember it being this, and I know people who've had the same experience. Like, I'd spent 18 months in the US. I'd built all these contacts and connections. And I'd done really well, actually, in terms of where you could go from that. But I then had to leave. I had no traction in the UK and things like that. And so what I ended up doing was and it was really personally dislocating because I was with this woman and stuff. And I had to, when I was in Egypt, I'd written a story for The Independent about landmines in the Western Desert. And they had been, it had got spiked, it had never run, but I had entered it for an Overseas Press Club award, which it won in the US. And I got some money from that, but I also, as a reward, got an internship with an overseas internship with a news organization. So I went and did that. So after I'd left the US, I had this weird year basically afterwards where I finished up in America and I went.
This is around 2009.
Yeah, it's 2000. This is 2000, and this is end of 2009. It's basically 2010. Yeah. So I went to Istanbul for 3 months and I worked for Reuters there. And again, it was a bit difficult because I'd spent a year learning Arabic and then they sent me to a Turkish-speaking country. And I had also, it was this thing that was like very prestigious to win in the US, but clearly like Reuters mothership had sort of foisted you on this bureau. I remember like I had to fight to get a chair and all sorts of like, classic intern inequities when I was there. But I really missed my girlfriend and things at the time, and it was freezing and I had no money and all this kind of thing. But I remember, I did it and I wrote stories and I got stories out there. And after that, it's funny how these things work out, but after that, the bureau chief was kind of, he took a bit of shine to me. And there was a possibility of going to Afghanistan for a job there, but it didn't come through. And then he said, I can't even remember the sequence, something like, we want to send a Westerner to Sierra Leone in Africa. And I had then I then did this other internship which at Columbia I had applied. Columbia had set up this exchange with Axel Springer, which is a big German publisher. And it was the first year they did it. And it was a bit of a weird marriage because Columbia is this sort of stentorian, American institution that takes journalism very seriously. And Axel Springer publishes Europe's biggest tabloid, The Bild, along with Die Welt, which is a newspaper and stuff. But they'd set this up. And I speak German because my parents were really into foreign languages when I was a kid, so I get sent abroad a lot. And I applied for this and got it. So I then had this other internship where I went and... So I went to Turkey for 3 months. I then went to Berlin and worked for this German paper for 3 months, which was great. Actually, it was really interesting. I mean, and I can speak German, but I rapidly found I could not write German. It's not the same thing. But I had a really interesting time. And then I went to Africa. But what is, I suppose, in retrospect about that year is it sounded, I spent 3 months in New York and then 3 months in Turkey and 3 months in Germany. It sounded really great, but it was actually incredibly stressful because I had no idea what was happening next. And I felt really dislocated. And then the Africa thing, I remember going to see them. I'd applied for a job at the Times in London. I applied for their grad scheme and I got to the last 2 and was interviewed and didn't get it. And so that decision was kind of made for itself. And then I was offered this job in Africa, in Sierra Leone. And my family has a lot of links with Africa. So my grandmother was born in Kenya, and all her sisters and so forth grew up there. That's in East Africa, not West. And I'd spent 3 months teaching at a school there after I'd left the army and things. So they offered me this job, and it's a stringer job, which is so that technically the deal is theoretically you're a contractor, not a staffer, but I never signed a contract or anything. I mean, it's all quite vague. And the deal is that you can't work at that time, you couldn't work for their immediate competition. You couldn't work for AP or AFP or Bloomberg, but you could work for other people. And you were paid a retainer, so like a bit by the month, which was standard. And then you were paid wordage on top of that, depending how much you wrote. But so like the money was really bad, but it was enough to sort of cover. And I didn't negotiate on the money, which is a foolish thing. But I went and did this in Sierra Leone for 2 years. And it was, I mean, like, character forming is maybe how I'd sort of describe it a bit, I think. It's like, it wasn't, Sierra Leone had come out of war before I was there. So they had a really horrific civil war in the 1990s. But that finished in 2002. So it wasn't a conflict zone, but it was one of the least developed countries in the world, like very limited power, very limited things there. And the thing was, I was completely on my own. So my bosses were in Dakar in Senegal, and I saw them twice in 2 years. And you're just on your own, and you had to sort everything out. But so I did that for 2 years after that.
So they didn't give you any help in terms of sort of relocation advice or costs. You just kind of had to work it out on your own.
Yeah, you get nothing at all. I mean, and the dangerous thing, or slightly disreputable thing about that, I think doing those things, it is in some ways the last bastion of like really romantic foreign journalism that you can do as a young person. But part of it is it's about subcontracting risk. So if you send a staffer to these places, as an organization, you have a kind of duty of care, and you've got to pay transfer fees and housing and all of that. But like there's none of that at all. So literally, like, I flew to Senegal, met the bosses, and then flew to Sierra Leone. And it's quite a dramatic thing to arrive in Sierra Leone because the airport is at the other side of this huge estuary from the capital. And you can either get there to the capital by a helicopter, which sometimes crashes, or a boat, which sometimes sinks. I mean, it's not, rarely, once every 5 years, but it's very dramatic. And you arrive, and you had to set everything up. I mean, and that's why I kind of think, without being a sort of crusty old person now, like the advantage of doing that is that that's basically, you do that instead of being a young person in a newsroom being told to do like menial things, and it was, and because Sierra Leone was so, the infrastructure was so bad, you had to spend, just keeping stuff running, like you spend a lot of time looking for car parts, like a lot of time, like keeping your generator running. Like the communications were so bad that I had to go to hotels to file because they had satellite internet. And then Reuters gave me a BGAN, which is a kind of satellite modem, which they were like, use for anything. And then I ran up this $2,000 bill, and they were like, don't use it for anything. So it was quite difficult. I mean, it was fun, it's a fun, and I kind of made my way. So I worked for Reuters, and then I was doing a lot of photography at that time as well. So I was shooting for them as well. And then I wrote for everyone. I wrote a bit for the New York Times. I wrote a bit for the Observer, I think. I wrote mostly for The Economist as my second string. So I just emailed out of the blue the Africa editor before I went, a guy called Oliver August, who became a real mentor to me. He was like a really good editor because he'd been a correspondent in the field. I wrote a lot for him, and then I started writing magazine pieces. And this had begun really in the US. I had travel money as part of my scholarship, so I was able to cut around a bit. So I wrote a couple of profiles then, but I did in Sierra Leone 2 big profiles of former warlords. So one of which I sent you, this guy Strata in Sierra Leone. I did another one in Liberia, and in Senegal I did an election. So I was kind of finding my way with that. But it was, I don't know, like, I think now, like this was 10 years ago, right, that I went. And I think, that the amount of kind of energy it took to just like get off a plane in a country that you knew no one, to like find somewhere to live, to find somewhere to work, to find all of that, it's a young man's game doing that, I would say, or a young person's game, really. But yeah, that's what I did.
How much prep and research did you do beforehand? Had you sort of poured through the history books, done lots of reading? I mean, there's like the image of the sort of white foreign correspondent commenting on African politics is to lots of people quite problematic. How did you sort of navigate those sensitivities and, I guess, sort of reassure yourself and your readers that you knew what you were talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I did do reading before I went. I also lived there, right? So I do think there is a distinction between like parachuting in somewhere and just, going and spending time there. And the line with this is interesting. And I think, Reuters at the time and also now has been pushing to have more local staff doing things, which I think is good and is commendable. I think it's slightly delicate, but I can talk about what was slightly interesting in Sierra Leone is that before I'd got there, they'd had a woman called Katrina Manson was there. So she then did the Congo job for Reuters, and she went to the FT. So she was in East Africa for them. She's now in DC for them. But they'd had like on and off, and I think through the war, a local guy who must have been in his 50s or whatever. And obviously he was like, understandably disenchanted with this sort of succession of like 25-year-old white people turning up on his beat. And I tried, to sort of have a chat with him, and he didn't want it. But also I also had to spend quite a lot of time trying to verify the sort of quite random stuff he filed to Dakar, which, I remember once like driving miles out into the bush because a story had been reported that like 4 tons of marijuana had been found or something like that. And there was, slight skepticism about it. So I suppose the point here is like, I think it's really good that local reporters are coming through, but, in places where there's not, particularly a country like that that's been so disrupted and so forth, it can be tricky. I also think, there is a benefit actually in being an outsider in those environments because you are not beholden. And so like by the end of my time in Sierra Leone, my relationship with the government was really difficult. So, because I'd written a lot about corruption. And so like they would denounce me on the radio in a slightly kind of bizarre and somewhat amusing way, but nonetheless it was a little weird. And I once appeared on the front page of a newspaper with the headline "Misguided Journalist on Doomed Mission in Sierra Leone," which I greatly regret that I've not framed. But it was, I could do that because I was leaving, right? And because I was sort of on my way out. But I think basically that there should be more African voices writing, and I think African voices coming through in general is a really positive thing about that, absolutely. And when I left, I agreed that I thought these, like, I hadn't really been there long enough, but I thought these big kind of, I'm good now opine upon the state of the continent thing, I thought, yeah, is highly questionable. And I wrote a piece just about literally what I did on a day-to-day basis, which was like that I spent an enormous amount of time I said that life in Freetown at that time was a constant and never achieved search for 3 commodities. So for functional telecommunications, for electrical power, and for cash, because there was no, you couldn't pay for anything on a Visa. The highest denomination note was the 10,000, but there was 6,600 leones to the pound. So you actually needed like a lot of like physical cash to do anything. And that you just spent an enormous amount of time kind of doing this. And it was a pretty enervating process to go through. I think what I also found, the reason I came home in some ways, is that kind of expatriate society is quite fun, but it's also quite strange. And it was much more extreme in Sierra Leone, I think, than in somewhere like Ghana or Kenya or Senegal, where there's like a really established, educated, local middle class. Because in Sierra Leone it had been in a war and everyone who could had left, that was not really there. But that kind of expatriate thing, I kind of felt that a lot of people were running away from their lives, and I was probably one of them. And so I turned down 2 jobs in Africa when I came home. So I'd been offered I'd been offered the Congo job for Reuters, and I was offered a kind of roaming West Africa stringer job for The Economist. And I turned them both down, and I came home. And coming home was much harder than going, really, because I came back to London. I was 27. I'd never lived in London. I stayed with a friend of my mum's for 6 months. And you've got to kind of be doing that sort of thing, like running around a foreign country pretending to be a journalist, can be cover for not dealing with a lot of stuff in your life.
What were you not dealing with in your life?
Just kind of stuff with relationships with my family and things like that, which I feel I was able to address. But I'm also really glad that I addressed them. And I also had to make a decision, I think, about what kind of work I wanted to do. And that path, if you go on it and you work abroad, particularly in that kind of environment, the obvious track would be that you would end up working as a staffer for one of the wires. So for Reuters or for AP, potentially being a bureau chief for them. And I remember I'd seen what that involved. And I remember being in Sierra Leone with the Reuters like head of Africa when there was a revolution in the Congo, and he was like moving his correspondence around like pieces on a chessboard and stuff. It's really impressive, but I didn't want to do it. I wanted to write. And I suppose the other thing that was a continuous thing throughout my 20s was I kept trying to write novels unsuccessfully. So I'd first seriously tried to write a novel the year after I left university, and it was like desperately, painfully autobiographical, like everyone's. And but it secured me an agent. And after that, I literally spent like 7 years trying to write novels. So I when I'd lived in Egypt, I wrote this like lengthy screed, which was curiously, about a sort of unhappily married Englishwoman having an affair with a very erudite Egyptian guy against a background of increasing political uncertainty. And then the Arab Spring happened, and it went from being like eerily prophetic to just slightly wrong. So that got retired. And then I wrote a novel in Sierra Leone that was about fraud. I wrote a story about Westerners coming to try and buy gold at times that gold was very expensive and getting elaborately and extremely sophisticatedly ripped off by the Sierra Leoneans. And I wrote a novel that was based on this. And again, it was taken to market, but it didn't sell. And so, I was kind of trying to feel my way through this way. But I sort of knew that like I didn't want to do that. I wanted to write with a bit more of a capital W.
Do you think novels are in your future, or do you think you've sort of put those experiments to bed now?
No, I really hope they are, actually. And I feel I've actually, during the whole drama with the army book, which we'll come to, but I've started another one, which I've written 40,000 words of, which is completely different. It's a sort of farce, really. And I wrote it almost as an antidote to this very serious situation I was in. But I'd really like to pick that up, partly because it feels like it's something that I'd be really challenging myself doing. I also think I know more about how writing works now. And I thought when we had Simon Sivo Montefiore on the show, I'm not sure it would have gone out when we put this out, but like the fact that
to be forthcoming,
but he talked about combining that nonfiction writing and novel writing, and actually how they complement each other. So I really would like to pick that thread up again. Yeah.
Could we talk more generally about your life as a freelancer in the UK? How you make it work financially, what the makeup of your week is like, how you approach new publications, and your tips for pitching. That's about 5 questions in one. But if you could just tell us a little bit about what it's like for you as a freelancer.
Yeah, I can say like how it works now, and then with the caveat that like it took a long time to it's quite regularized now, and it's all quite stress free. But the caveat that it took a long time to build it to that point. So what I do a day a week editing for a kind of newsletter, which pays my rent. Firstly, I mean, it really does almost effectively sort of cover that. But it's also, I like it because it's collegiate and it's with people, and it's also completely self-contained. So I do a day where like I have to think, and it's hard work, but I kind of disengage mentally from what else is going on. And then I wrote magazine pieces. So I suppose when I came back from Africa, I had this, vague idea that I knew that I wanted to do this kind of magazine stuff. And what I have been able to do, I'm very proud of, is to build that to a point where it's a living. So I have most of my work now is well, it's split, but a lot of it is for American magazines that pay well. And I write these big pieces, and I probably do between sort of 4 and 7 a year, depending what else I'm doing. And they are, if you keep that machine running, because it's all paid in retrospect and everything takes months, you have to, the thing has to be churning. You have to have things at different stages. But that work, those big American pieces are still paid at north of $2 a word, so that, they're quite well remunerated. And I do that, and I do my Thursday, and then I do a little bit, I've done various bits of other editing work. I've done stuff for NGOs, I've done a bit of copywriting stuff for the UN, but what I've kind of built now is a framework that like it provides me. I'm not making banker money, but I'm making like decent money. I have my own flat, and it also feels, it's relatively stress free. But it took a really long time to do that, and I didn't. I had when I came back from Africa, I had some support from my family. For a bit, because I was kind of finding my way. But I think what I didn't conceive, I think it would have helped if I had conceived earlier, like, okay, I'm going to do 2 days a week of sort of just money work and other stuff. I mean, I did all sorts of quite weird things. And what I'd found is like, I never starved, right? It was all, there was a safety net and things like that, but it is a stressful way to live, like to be kind of constantly hustling and constantly sort of doing that. And what I feel now, the thing that's just changed substantially in my work life now is I've just been given a contract by 1843 from The Economist I've done work for. And that, I mean, both in terms of time and remuneration, is effectively half a salary, basically. So I kind of, what is pleasing now is with that and with my day a week, like that's I'm kind of okay, like financially, without anything else on top of that. And what I find, which is just, it's a huge relief off one's back and one's mind to do that, because I think that what you find yourself doing is you find yourself running a business, right? And that's not why I wanted to do this. I think I've always been quite allergic to institutions in some ways. I suppose I've bounced along this way, but you find yourself, and I remember like the first time I had to do a tax return and stuff like that, I was just like, this is not what I signed up for. Like, I'm really bad at this stuff. I find it really stressful and I find it really difficult. And what I'm quite pleased with now is like, I've kind of gripped that stuff. I mean, it took, maybe 12 years or whatever to work out how to do it. But I think that actually there is something about, because ultimately, like, money is freedom, right? And this kind of thing. Like, if you are covering your costs and making your own way and stuff like that, you can do what you want. But I would say though that there were, I don't want to kind of present myself as some kind of up by the bootstrap hero that I'm not. Certainly, when I went to Columbia, I had some help from my parents, and subsequently at other times, and then particularly we can come to this. But when my book all hit the buffers, and I was suddenly expecting 25 grand that wasn't there, I was able to be supported then. But now, like, it kind of works and it's quite smooth, and it just reduces your, when we had Samantha on the show, and he was just like, he'd clearly just like burnt himself absolutely to the ground, like by writing magazine articles, by not doing anything else. I think that, I think if I was doing it again, like if I was coming back, I was in my late 20s, I had 5 years of journalistic experience, I'd say, okay, what is the first thing is like, I need to build a framework that provides me enough money, but gives me enough time to do my, to do the work I want to do. And, there's quite a lot of different ways you can do that. I think what you actually need is something regular. Like, you can't, the problem with doing tutoring or something like that is, it's unpredictable and you're traveling and all of that. But actually, editorial work or, other things, there are things you can do to find your way through, which will give you the breathing space financially. And I think actually it's tricky because you do need a bit of like, I do think if you want to plunge yourself into freelancing, it does to an extent need to be existential. Like, you have to say, okay, this has to work. I need to kind of make this work. But I suppose, as Natalie Haynes said, like, it's worth doing some sensible planning about it as well.
Do you think that you have got the balance right now? Do you have weekends off? Do you, how much work do you do in an average week? Do you try and do like 9 to 5, Monday to Friday?
So I think everyone who I know who works freelance is really interested in like how you work and like how you work efficiently, because ultimately your finite, the thing you cannot scale is your time. Like, you only have a certain amount of time. So I do everything I can, and I'm quite into sort of all this, like, woo-woo is sort of the wrong word, but like, I can tell you, I get up, I meditate for 20 minutes, I walk to the shop to expose myself to daylight so that I feel awake, and buy a coffee, I come back. I also work with a coach who I acquired by accident on this assignment. It's a long story, but we met through something I was writing about, and we subsequently ended up working together, who's a sort of brusque Scandinavian guy. And I work with him on like making plans and everything. I work from home now because of the lockdown. And what I try and do is make a plan at the beginning of the week of like, what are the key things that that I'm trying to accomplish this week. The other thing that I find really important for me is having a lot of irons in the fire. So I have like 7 magazine assignments going at some time, but they're all at different stages of completion. And I have my day a week editing, and then I have the book stuff. And you're hedging yourself financially, but you're also hedging yourself emotionally then, because if something doesn't work, then you have some protection of it. But I really try and take weekends off. What I'm trying to do more of is take holidays more, which I haven't been very good at, partly because it would just seem such a waste of money in some ways to be like, I'm just going to throw money on an experience that I'll have nothing away from it. But I really do try to not work at weekends, and I try and try and like work efficiently as much as possible. But I think it's I think I was kind of quite acclimatized to that, because right from the start in Africa, you were on your own. You know, there was no one telling you to get out of bed and everything like that. So that's how it fits.
Could we move on now to your book, The Changing of the Guard? The original idea obviously grew out of your gap year commission in the British Army. How did you go about putting a proposal together for that, and turning that into a book that you could sell?
Yeah, I mean, with difficulty and with a lot of missteps and back and forth, basically. I mean, so I'd done this year in the army when I was 18, which was kind of my rebellion against my parents, actually, in retrospect. I didn't really understand that at the time, but I came from a sort of academic family in Cambridge, and the thing that I could do that was completely in contrast to that was to cut my hair and join the army. And then, very infuriatingly, they were very supportive. But I had this experience, and I had been abroad I came back from Africa at the end of 2012, and I had this idea. It was essentially 10 years since I'd seen the army. So I do it to write about the army. And I kind of knew, I'd spent all this time failing to write novels, but I knew like I wanted to write books. And I remember just like feeling my way through it. I had this idea. I had the idea that like I had this glimpse of how the army had been, which was it was a fleeting experience, but it was valid. And I could go back and see it. And I worked up a proposal with this agent. And again, it's worth saying here that I'd had this agent throughout those kind of 8 years after university. And I'd met her because I knew her son at university. It was never a proper kind of acquisition. And this is, I suppose, why I'm always grilling agents we have on the show, because I feel in that sense, like, I think I was a bit naive, and I don't think she was that engaged. And like, I did a lot. I wrote all this stuff, and it was all, nothing really seemed to happen. And so what happened was, I wrote a proposal. I wrote like 2 pages. I sent it to Anthony Beaver. He was like, "This is not a book proposal. You need to do a lot more." Thank you, Anthony. He was right. And then I worked it up and I developed it for a long time. But the fundamental issue with it was essentially the British military runs hyper constricted access for reporters. And in general, if you're going to talk to people who are in the army or in bed, you have to sign a document that lets the army, it's a transaction. It gives them pre-publication oversight of what you see in exchange for access, ostensibly on grounds of what's called operational security, which is military secrets, or personnel security, which is private details. But what always happens is that gets used as an excuse to just gut the whole thing. And so I knew, I knew I needed to go to Afghanistan, but I also knew if I signed this contract, the book would be gutted. And so in the end, I got the documentation lawyered, and it turned out that if I went under the aegis of a journalist to do a journalistic assignment, that the rules would apply for that piece of journalism, but not for a subsequent book. And here, the fact that I had an existing relationship as a freelancer with The Economist was helpful, in that The Economist sponsored an embed, and I went in 2014 and got out there and was able to kind of get my snippet of access then. And in due course, obviously, they were very difficult, and they tried to gut a bit of journalism stuff. But I did that, and I had this proposal that was developing. And I was kind of feeling my way through this. I think the big lesson I would say is, like, you do none of this stuff alone. Like, you just have to ask people for advice and all of that. And then I got hired by Newsweek, kind of out of the blue, because a woman I'd been at Columbia with, who was British but had then worked in India for a long time, had come back and was hired by this new European edition of Newsweek, which came in with lots of funding and excitement. And I did a piece for them. I went to Monaco and I wrote a piece about a plastic surgeons convention in Monaco, which was kind of fascinatingly weird. And they liked it, and they offered me a contract. And I took it. And so I then was hired on what seemed like this extraordinary gig of, to write, I think, 10,000 word stories over a year or something. It seemed too good to be true, and indeed it was when the magazine went bankrupt like 15 months later. But that then sort of took me out of that position. And this proposal that I'd had sat on ice because I was doing these big pieces. And then we all got fired, like, unceremoniously and overnight at Newsweek when the Americans pulled the funding. And I was suddenly like left, with like this lease on this flat that I'd signed up and stuff to deal with. And when I'd been at the magazine, I'd met Alex Perry, who was a former long-standing correspondent for Time, but he'd been a real mentor of mine. And I said, look, I've got this book deal, but I'm not really sure what's going on with it with this agent. And he put me in touch with his agent. And his agent, who is now my agent, like spun it up and in 5 weeks had organized a 5 publisher book auction, and it was all incredibly exciting. And it was weird because this was 2015, I'd literally spent like 8 years trying to write novels, and like nothing had happened, and they would get sent out into the ether and no response, and suddenly like it seemed that everyone wanted to publish this book, and it was auctioned 5 ways, and it was incredibly exciting. And then I wrote it, and then all the difficulties arose.
So could you tell us a little bit more, obviously, about those difficulties? But I'm wondering at what point in the process the difficulties, particularly regarding copy approval, set in. Am I right in thinking you'd done more than 200 interviews before the trouble started?
I did 260 interviews all in over 3 years. And in parallel, I was doing my other work. So in terms of the money, in terms of ATN honesty, so I didn't take the top offer for the book. Top offer was from HarperCollins for £52,000. I took a second offer for £45,000, which sounds like quite a lot of money, but as we've discussed on the show before, the way things are calculated, like 15% goes to your agent, so you never see that. And it's divided into 3 portions. So, the amount you get up front, I think it was like 15 grand, something. It wasn't going to fund me through. And I was looking at how I would fund myself through in parallel. I actually had like 2 ghostwriting jobs that I got, and both of them fell through. And I ended up just doing my magazine stuff and and kind of scratching my way through that way. So there was this 3-year period where I did it, and I had a visiting fellowship at this place in Oxford called the Changing Character of War program. And in general, like with all the interviewing, it was fine basically, because you're just talking to people at that stage. And, I was totally open about what I was doing in the book, but because of my background, because I'd been in the army and things like that, I was in some ways perceived as a sort of friendly quantity. And then I wrote the first draft, and, again, you're feeling your way through this really, but, I wrote the first draft, and I had to like boil this down into a fact-checked, nailed down thing, which meant I had to do all the process of fact-checking and right to reply. And what was difficult then was like, I knew how to do this at a magazine piece, but the book as published is 35 times as long as a 5,000 word magazine piece, right? So the techniques just kind of didn't work. But I pushed through and kind of did. I certainly could have done things differently, but the process worked in the end. But I just caused this like bow wave of shock and anxiety throughout the army, because I was having to write to people and being like, so-and-so says that you made the wrong decision here, so-and-so says this, and all of that. It caused like and because it's a small and closed world, and they all know each other, it caused like, shock and awe, really. And this guy at Oxford, who was my supervisor, who had a very close relationship with the army, just ghosted me at this point. Like, he just wouldn't see me or anything like that. And I'd paid fees to attend the program, and eventually I kind of forced this, and I contacted other people and said, look, you do need to actually see me here. And we had this sort of slightly surreal meeting in the front quad at Pembroke College, where he didn't want anything to do with the book, and he told me that I should anonymise senior commanders and write more about sport in the army and stuff like that. I was just like, this is getting a bit silly at this point. And I didn't have further contact with him. And then the book I finished it, I was utterly exhausted. Like, I went off and did this big walk in Spain, and it went through all its legal checks and everything, and it was literally like about to be signed off. And then I had to write to someone for right to reply. She then wrote to everyone she could find associated with the project, including this guy at Oxford. He then wrote to Random House saying they were going to get sued. And that then freaked the publisher. I mean, I don't know what was going on in the background, but then like the publisher went to this sort of sacred conclave and then announced to me that they were only going to publish the book if we gave copy approval to everyone mentioned in it. There's a lot of people mentioned in this book, but like that everyone in the book signed off in writing about what was said about them and was happy about it. That we also gave the book to the Ministry of Defence and let them provide their amendments. And even that might not be enough. And I was just like, what, I remember thinking like, what the actual fuck is this? And we had like rounds. My first response was like, I'm going straight to the newspapers. And my agent very wisely like talked me down. And we went through like every, reams of reporting documentation submitted, all of that kind of thing. It was clear it wouldn't move their position. They then asked to see my agent in my absence, told him they were cancelling my contract, asking me to pay my advance back, and asking me to pay, I think, half their legal fees, which was about 26 grand all in, because I hadn't got the secondary portions. I couldn't pay this money. I didn't have it. I'd spent it. Yeah, so that was that. And I then gathered a coalition of 8 press freedom organisations, including Index on Censorship, Reporters Without Borders, led by the European Centre for Press and Media Freedom, who wrote to Random House, who wrote to the Germans who were right at the top, and said, like, this is wrong, don't do this. And that didn't move their position. And so I'd been in touch with The Guardian. I gave the material to The Guardian. The Guardian wrote about it because I knew basically that someone else had to assess the situation. Because obviously, like, I was going to say this was a total outrage, but it was my book and I was partial. And so someone else had to come in and assess it. And I think The Guardian did a pretty fair job on that. And then after that, I saw that Scribe had published Billion Dollar Whale, which had a similar gestation, and went to see them. And they wanted to do the book. And then there was the issue of getting the rights back, because Random House refused to release the copyright to the book unless I signed a non-disclosure agreement, which I wasn't willing to do. And so then the only way to get the rights back was to buy them out. So Scribe put up 10 grand, which is as much as they could provide. And there was a question about crowdfunding the rest, but I thought the optics on that were not ideal. So what happened is all that money from Scribe has gone to PRH, and then theoretically I owe them another 10 grand by September this year, but we'll see if I think we'll see if that happens. I'm hopeful of not having to pay that. So it was like it was an utterly savage and totally brutal experience. It took about 2 years, but it was, I think, actually, what the book has come out now. My fear at Christmas was it was going to vanish in a COVID-shaped hole in the news cycle, and no one was going to read it. And that has not been the case at all. It's had a great deal of publicity, and very polarized publicity. There's been absolute raves and absolute kind of fury at it as well, which is a funny experience, because I think a lot of people with their first books coming out, the real thing is like just scrapping to get people to notice it at all, and that has not been the issue with this. But obviously, the response has been very, very polarized. I think I have learned an enormous amount through that experience. But in terms of, I think it's maybe a better journalist. And it also was a sort of baptism of fire to some of the realities of how British publishing actually works, But I think what was in retrospect was like, I was so tired when it was done, having just finished the book. You're just like physically tired, but kind of almost like spiritually tired. Like you've done this sort of 3 years of work. And then to be told like, right, you're now back at the bottom of the mountain, and what are you going to do?
You mentioned it making you a better journalist, and you mentioned that you would have done some things differently. What have you learned, and what would you have done differently?
I mean, I think the question is, I think essentially it's about source management in some ways. I think what I had to do, and I knew with this book, a lot of what I would have to do would be to present very difficult information to people and ask for their response in order, for it to be fair. And I did all of that, and that is why the book has its rigor. I think what I've learned is you can do that. You can do that in a less confrontational way in some ways. You can get someone on the phone, you can talk them through it. What is difficult, again, is when you're having to do it in such a large number of cases and across such scale. That is because I had no research assistance with this. It was just me doing that. And I think I'm better now. What I think is interesting, if you make clear, like, you're an honest broker, you will hear people out, and you'll give them a fair crack of the whip as fair as you can. Actually, you can discuss really vexed stuff with people, and they still will engage. But it does require a sort of level of professional gravitas and a level of kind of emotional experience that I think perhaps you can only get by going through that. I think on a slightly, there's a kind of procedural piece. I think perhaps, and this is potent, like, I thought my editor was my friend, basically. Like, he was he's the same age to me, and he was outstandingly good at editing that book. Like, he really was, and a lot of it owes to him. But at the end, like, he vanished, it was all the decisions made above him. I think it was pushed down, but like an understanding of actually what a professional relationship is and what the boundaries need to be in that, But yeah, I think it's kind of, it's difficult, isn't it? Because I think a lot of these experiences, like I was saying, not getting a first at university, I found it devastating at the time, but I learned a lot about it. And this was, this went on for, the shit hit the fan with my book in January of 2019, and it came out in February of 2021, right? So it was 2 years of difficulty. But I think it's also, you do not do these things alone. I just think that's the overwhelming point. Like, the people who, supported, writers, friends, people in NGOs. Actually, I just think that's such a kind of lesson. I know we're up against time, but it's been quite the ride. But I think you have to do it and move forward and that sort of thing.
Just one final question. In terms of the pieces you sent over for me to look at, the 1843 one on the NHS, which is fantastic, and we did not get a chance to discuss, the New Statesman profile of Valentine Strasser, and obviously your book, it strikes me that a sort of theme across those ones in particular is institutions, structures of power, and accountability. Are those topics that you think you're interested in, or do you think there's a sort of other overarching sort of animus to your work?
It's a really good question. And I know from when we've asked other writers this, they find it really hard to answer. I think I think there is some truth about that. I felt with the army, I felt angry. And that's not actually the best way to come at journalism. But the army that I remembered, that I saw for a glimpse when I was 18, preached above every human virtue this idea of accountability, this idea that what it was to be an army officer, that you literally held your boys, which is the phrase I would use, your men, and it was mostly men, their lives are in your hands, and that it is on you. And I remember coming back and starting to report this and just seeing that like there hadn't been any accountability, that at the top level there just had been almost none. And that, I think, was in a sense a bit naive of me. That is what happens with institutions. So there was definitely a sort of big accountability driver with that. I found with Strasser, what I found interesting with those West African warlords was like they were like kings in the Shakespearean sense, right? Like they had like personally killed people, and they had they held power in a way that doesn't really exist in Western politics anymore. And with the NHS, it was like with that piece, it was a kind of opportunist thing. I remember like the pandemic began, and I wrote to my editor. I was like, "Look, should we do this?" I was like, I proposed that, or I proposed like a morgue. I think those were the two things that I wanted. So that connected thing. But I also have like a real soft spot for like weird communities. That's the other side of my journalism. Like I've written about skiers in Scotland, who are determined to go skiing even though the climate's really weird. Or like when I wrote this long read about Magic Radio, which is like my 5,000 word piece on easy listening. Like I love getting in, that's not about nailing malfeasance, right? It's a completely different idea about something that's sort of weird and picaresque and fun. And I also find that fascinating. It is very hard to quantify and have an idea for another book that's very different. But I think the thing is, like, I really love doing the stuff I do, and I feel I just find it the most exciting and like the most delightful stuff, and I feel so privileged to get to do it. But it did take a lot of like hustle to be able to do it and to be able to make it a job. Those were the two things.
Great. Well, thank you, Simon, for your time and for suggesting this instalment of the podcast.
Thank you, Rachel, for humouring me. I look forward to to interviewing you at some stage in the future.
I don't have an appetite for that, but yeah, thank you for speaking so candidly, and I will look forward to speaking to myself about the about the interview at a later date.
Hello, it's us again. Obviously an unusual episode, but Rachel, it's a great pleasure to be interviewed by you. And as I said afterwards, I found the process oddly cathartic. I'm not sure what that says, but thank you very much for having me on the show and asking all those in-depth and thoughtful questions.
Maybe I should have considered a career as a therapist if you found it therapeutic. I don't know whether you were meant to have found it therapeutic. Surely it should have been grilling and hard-hitting.
Well, I think it was grilling and hard-hitting. I think cathartic, not therapeutic. I think it was just given, in some ways, how difficult the birth of that book was, to be able to sort of talk about it. Now that there's a little bit of distance on it was a good thing. And yeah, I realised it's kind of weird to look back on one's career and try and pull it into some kind of shape or perspective as well.
Yeah, I enjoyed learning more about your early freelancing days because I didn't know that much about it. Obviously, I've only met you in recent years, so I know more about your work for 1843 and other publications, but it was insightful to learn about that. So yeah, thank you for speaking candidly.
Well, you're welcome. My wilderness years, as we could call them. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Akam.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our graphic design is by James Edgar, and our score is by Jess Danheiser.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Always Take Notes, on Twitter at Take Notes Always. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, please do. That's also at Always Take Notes. If you'd like to leave a review on iTunes or get in touch with us, do that as well. Thanks.